The town may be kind of small, but these folks have big smiles and big hearts, and they know what it is to have simple fun down our way, where old-fashioned singing and homey gatherings make living mighty pleasant.
Is that a nod to David Foster Wallace? Didn't he have a book of short stories called something with a lobster?
I don't know. I'm not familiar with that. I mean, I'm familiar with his work. I read Infinite Jest, but I don't know anything about what. Lobster.
Come on, John. Did you finish Infinite Jest?
I did, yeah. I did. I'm from the 90s, you know.
I am too, and I couldn't finish that fucking thing.
I read the footnotes.
Hey, trolling.
Welcome to Abandoned Albums, the documentary podcast where we take a closer look at some albums that may have been forgotten about over time, some albums you might not even know existed, and some albums by up-and-coming artists we think you should know about. I'm your host, Keith R. Higgins. Digitally sitting beside me is none other than Geoff Calhoun.
Hey, homie.
What up?
It's another Abandoned Albums podcast hour-ish.
On this episode, Keith and Geoff welcome singer and songwriter John Strohm into Thunderlove Studio.
The paper doesn't give many details. Tell me about this.
Slip, slide, fade away. You know it's true, you gotta pay to play, you see. I feel so good today. Oh, come on, baby, don't you take that away from me. Here you come and there I go. In the answer, baby, it's still no.
Maybe people are coming in for the first time on this episode, and if you are, welcome to the podcast. But if you've listened to previous episodes, I've established myself as a former college radio guy. But John's roots, I think, are deeply embedded in college radio. You know, his first band, the Blake Babies, was really important to college radio. And I think within those confines, wildly successful.
To me, the Blake Babies were just prior to that no alternative movement.
Yeah, perfect. When talking about his career, he did taste some of that success that alternative radio bands met with. I mean, this guy toured with the Lemonheads, but what I want to talk to him about is this record Vestavia, because, you know, full transparency here, Keith. Vestavia, because John was living in Birmingham, Alabama at the time.
Mm-hmm.
I live in Birmingham, Alabama, so I have a deep familiarity with the album. And Vestavia is the name of the high school that I graduated from. So I've got all sorts of ties. My band opened for John on this tour. It is a record very true to the spirit of Abandoned Albums. If we are to take as our task the job of finding albums that people missed and maybe shouldn't have. Unpretentious. I don't think that there are a lot of frills, but really damn solid. I mean, great songs, great execution, great production, and the mixing. I mean, all of the technical elements are superb.
Yeah.
But all of that means nothing if the songs aren't good, and the songs are very good.
Right.
The integrity of the music is amazing. This is one I wish people had not missed. I don't think there are any bad songs on the record. So this is one that I want to explore. I want to get the stories behind it. I want to make the album more accessible to our listeners. If we open your eyes to this one, I want to know about it, because this is a crusade for me.
Consider the crusade started. Here's our conversation with John Strohm.
Thank you, John. I want to ask you a question. How does punk rock kid from Indiana end up in Boston?
Well, that part of it was easy. I was sort of reluctant to go to college. My parents are professors, and I was not a particularly good student back then. I wasn't a terrible student, but I was just an average student. But I was a good musician. I was really fired up on getting to a city and getting a band going. So I sort of conned them into paying for me to go to Berklee College of Music.
Oh, great.
That was my my path to Boston, was getting my mom to drive me out and drop me off at the Berklee dorms. And that was fall of 1985. So that part of it was really easy, getting there. They were happy 2 years later when I dropped out because they didn't want to pay for it anymore. But fortunately, I had a second run at school, and I had a bit better academic experience. But anyway, I was 18 and just wanted to get a band going. That was my whole deal.
And you did.
Yeah, you did.
I did. Yeah, I was determined. Well, I was thinking about this because I have college age kids now. I have a daughter who's in college, and I have a high school senior son, and then a younger one. But I was thinking that all the stuff that I got up to in high school, if I was doing it now, I would definitely frame it as, very impressive stuff in a college essay. But at the time, it was, just I was a slacker, up to no good. But we were actually very ambitious with our little local punk scene. We started our own all ages club, and we used to bring national acts there, and started bands that toured around the Midwest and put out records. We were doing it all, and it was, none of that was framed as entrepreneurship or however we describe it now. But it was just trying to take a really boring place and make it fun.
That's how you connected with Paul Mahern?
Yeah, Paul. Well, I didn't meet Paul until I'd known of him and seen him perform for a couple of years, because I was just a huge fan of the Zero Boys. That was literally my favorite band. The Zero Boys absolutely inspired me. And I saw them when I was 14, when I was a high school freshman. We used to have these free concerts downtown Bloomington. I guess it wasn't that boring growing up there because there was stuff going on. So I could walk downtown by the public library and they'd have bands play. And one of those bands was the Zero Boys. It just floored me. It was just incredible. Because that was right around the time they were making Vicious Circle. I just couldn't believe it was a local band. And so I was kind of obsessed with them. And that was one of the things that really brought me into being a hardcore obsessed kid. And I met Paul a couple years later, but I was always kind of in awe of him. And I didn't really get to know Paul until we hired him to record Blake Babies. So the last real Blake Babies record that we made as a group was the Rosie Jack World EP, which he produced. And then he made all those Antenna records that I made. And we went back in the studio with him in 2000 to make the final sort of reunion Blake Babies record called God Bless the Blake Babies. And then he mixed my most recent record that's yet to come out. So I've had a long working relationship, but we shared a house back in the 90s. You guys talked to Kim Fox. Kim and Paul and I were roommates. So that was fun and interesting.
It seems like every episode we find some strange connection to a previous episode. So we'll go with Paul for this one.
Well, I wanted to see what this was all about because, Geoff, I appreciate you reaching out, and I love talking about Vestavia. It's a record I'm proud of. It's a great story. So I went and sort of scrolled through the list on Spotify of previous episodes. I was like, oh, there's a friend, there's another friend. So I've listened to several of them, and it's great, but it's really fun hearing people I know.
Oh, I'm sorry, you're too late.
Excuse me, do you know who I am?
I have absolutely no idea.
Good.
As the president of Rounder Records, I imagine your Rolodex is one of the more impressive ones.
Presently, I'm no longer president of Rounder Records. At the top of 22, I left that job and went back into law practice. I had a great experience as a label head, and I learned so much. And it definitely added depth and nuance to what I do now, having been on the other side of deals. And what I'm doing now is I'm leaning deeper into technology, and I'm representing clients that are completely outside of music, but I'm also representing music clients. And my passion is really working with artists. And the one thing about running a label that was sometimes uncomfortable for me was really just being on the other side of the table from artists. I feel fine about all the deals we made, and I think Concord's a great company, that Rounder's parent, but ultimately I'm more comfortable being, purely an artist rep or just an artist. That's my lifelong passion is artist development and music. So I'm thrilled to get to do what I do. And Nashville's an amazing place to do it. So it's a good outcome, and I'm happy to be doing what I'm doing. It's not a tragic story at all.
I do want to spend most of our time talking about Vestavia and the yet to be released record that is one of the premium perks of doing a show like this is every once in a while, Keith and I get to listen to an album that hasn't hit shelves yet.
Nice.
And so that was a real treat to get to hear the as yet released album, and we'll get to that. But to get to Vestavia, we want to contextualize that and talk about everything that came before Vestavia. And that was 1997 that Vestavia released, right?
We made it in 98 and it came out in 99. It took a minute to come out. So we've already talked about moving to Boston and, having the dreams of having a band and seeing the world and, reading all those Jack Kerouac books or whatever was motivating me. It's interesting because I was not thinking at all in terms of a career. I wasn't thinking in terms of making money. I was thinking in terms of adventure. I wanted to be in a band because I was fascinated by the adventure of getting in the van or getting to go overseas and getting to make records. And that's really what I wanted to do. And Frida, my high school girlfriend who followed me to Boston, was on the exact same page. And I had come up playing drums. I was a drummer in high school, and I was a good drummer. I was a working drummer. And Frida at some point, she's like, well, if you're doing that, I'm doing it too. So what am I going to play? And she wasn't a musician, and she's like, I want to play drums. So I took her down to the basement where I had my drums, and Frida could play immediately. And within 10 minutes, she was playing a good time and keeping a beat. And the funny thing is that I taught her sort of basics of drumming over a couple of afternoons. And it was about 5 years before she learned anything else on the drum. She learned how to do a basic beat. And so it was a great drummer to play with because I would help her come up with the parts and she would play them exactly the same every time. And she developed a great feel. And I think toward the end of first year when she just moved out there, we met Juliana Hatfield, who was my songwriting partner, our partner in Blake Babies. And this is another window into Frida's personality. She just decided Juliana was going to be our singer, and we didn't even know her. We just saw her walking around. And she's like, that girl is going to be our singer. And I was like, well, what does she do? And she's like, I have no idea. But just look at her. And for just context,
that one.
I'm assuming you guys are old enough to have lived through the 80s with some consciousness. So the 80s was an interesting time because underground culture was truly underground. And
it was.
There was mainstream entertainment. We wanted no part of that. And then there was the underground. And the underground was sort of balkanized by styles or genres of music. You could really look at somebody and know from their outfit what their tribe was. It's like, oh, that's a goth person. That's a hardcore kid. Whatever.
Oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm. We wouldn't confuse where somebody was coming from based on how they were dressed. So we could look at Juliana and say, she's got to be one of us. She loves REM and the Replacements, and it was true. So one night we had a few drinks and we just went to her room and knocked on the door and Frida took the lead. She said, hey, we think we want to start a band with you. And she said, great. And we were making music that same night.
Wow.
That was a pretty vibrant music scene, especially in the the late 80s through really the mid 90s, I think. That must have been pretty exciting.
When I moved there, I was aware of a couple things. I knew about the hardcore scene, which I was interested in, but I was moving away from hardcore. I'd been a hardcore musician and I'd gotten more interested in, like bands I mentioned, or Husker Du, or Velvet Underground, or whatever. I was more interested in songs. But when I got there and started experiencing the music scene, I'll tell you one story, and this connects all the dots so far. So I couldn't get into bars, of course, because I was underage. All the music was happening in bars. The all ages clubs were all punk rock, but you had to be able to get into, several of these great nightclubs. And I couldn't get in, so I didn't know what any of these bands sounded like. So I found this show on the Emerson College radio station called Metrowave. And eventually Blake Babies were on it a couple times. I played on there with Lemonheads. It was a really cool institution. And in fact, the DJ for Metrowave was a guy named Mark Elghini, who became our roommate and Lemonhead's tour manager. But at that time, I didn't know anything except it was a cool show. And Metrowave, every Sunday night, they'd have a live band play on the radio. There was a local band. So that's how I got to hear what all the bands sounded like. So they had Dump Truck, they had, Scruffy the Cat, they had, Volcano Suns, all the really cool bands that, are probably kind of under the radar, but, Boston music freaks know these bands. They were great. Treat Her Right, it's another one, became more. So it was exciting, hearing these bands like, wow, these are great bands. And then one Sunday they had the Lemonheads when they were in their infancy. It was a trio where Evan Dando and Ben Diley used to switch between drums and guitar. They were kind of scrappy. I was interested in it. I was like, yeah, I get this. It's kind of, evolved hardcore or whatever. And then they blew my mind because they covered Livin' in the 80s by the Zero Boys.
Oh, wow.
They're just like, here's a song by the Zero Boys. I'm like, wait a minute, what is happening? Because to me, Zero Boys was a local band. I knew that there were rumors that they'd been out and played CBGB or whatever. But it turned out that the Harvard radio station, WHRB, they had this show called Record Hospital, which was like a music geek record collectors sort of clubhouse. And all the guys in Bullet LaVolta were DJs there, and people that started Matador Records. It was a real club of music snobs. And HRB, Record Hospital, revered Zero Boys. So because the Lemonheads hung out there, it's like, oh, you got to check this out. So they're like, oh yeah, we're going to cover that song. But anyway, I had to meet them because I had to find out what the deal was. So I went to their show, introduced myself, and then like 2 weeks later, I was their drummer. Anyway, for me, an Indiana kid, this is all very exciting.
We return you now to your regularly scheduled program.
Blake Babies had some success. We got on Mammoth Records. We started making records. We for a minute, I was in both Blake Babies and Lemonheads. I left the Lemonheads because I had to choose because both bands were busy. We stuck around Boston and during the sort of buildup of Blake Babies. And once it got to the point where we were kind of eking out a meager living, Frida and I moved back to Indiana. That was kind of curtains for Blake Babies because Juliana's in Boston, we're in Indiana. So I got my own record deal with Mammoth Records, and that's when Frida and I formed Antenna. So, then I was in Bloomington and we made a couple records, and I don't know what to say about that period except that it was depressing and hard. In the early 90s, I was making these records for Mammoth. I was partying too much. I was hanging out in my hometown. Now I was kind of, had sort of tasted it a little bit. My former bandmates now were huge stars, Juliana and Evan, they're everywhere. And I rejoined the Lemonheads as a touring guitar player, which was, a fun way to spend my time, but it wasn't a career. I made one solo record for this local label, Flat Earth, called Caledonia, which was really just a collection of some projects I've been working on. I tried to start a country band and, kind of put it all together into a record and put it out. But it was not me trying to launch a career as a solo artist. That's when I was doing other stuff. And really kind of got to the point where I was sort of spinning my wheels a little bit. And hold on, my wife's calling. That's actually a great time for Heather to call because that's when Heather showed up in my life and changed everything. So,
oh, wow.
Yeah. Heather Christensen, now Heather Strohm, my wife of almost 23 years. We met in, I think, 1995, and she was a business student. She was not a musician. She was not particularly interested in my musician lifestyle, but she was awesome. We started hanging around. She kind of came on some road dates with Lemonheads. We were dating. I don't think at that time either of us necessarily thought we were going to spend our lives together, but, we clicked and we enjoyed being together. And there was sort of this creeping anxiety in our relationship because I'd clearly kind of hit a wall with the music career I was trying to pursue. I was not in a creative space to really do my best work. And, part of that was because I was, struggling a little bit with mental health like people that age tend to do. And I was partying too much. And Heather really kind of helped to bring me out of that because she was not from that world. She was kind of, like asking hard questions like, what's next? What are you going to do with your life? And then once we started to contemplate the possibility of having a real life together, it was like, well, what's that going to be like? And I really didn't know. And that was the source of great anxiety, because I was kind of in my late 20s by this point, and the doors weren't opening for the career that I wanted, and I really didn't know what was next. And it had not crossed my mind to become a lawyer or anything like that. That just would seem crazy at the time. So at some point around 97, 98, Heather graduated from college and she moved to Alabama, which is where she's from. She moved to Birmingham, and I kind of tagged along. And Lemonheads did a long, grim, year-long tour in 97, 98, and at the end of which, we were all just kind of bereft. And we had this kind of tension in our relationship where it's like, okay, it'd be great to get married, great to have a family, but, what's that going to look like? And so I kind of made a deal with Heather. And, I haven't really thought about this for a while in these terms, but I made a deal with her where I said, look, I'm going to make one more record, and I'm going to make the best record I can make. And it's either going to be my career or I'm going to do something else, but the promise I made to her was, I am going to give this my best shot. Basically, I was down in Birmingham, just off tour, and it was like, if this doesn't work, then I'm going back to school and figuring it out. I'm gonna admit defeat. I'm gonna throw in the towel, and I should pause for a second, and I'm not letting you guys ask any questions. I'm just kind of No, I should pause for a second, and I should say that there's something that's a little bit hard for me to relate to now, but it's a really important factor for understanding the story, which is that how I thought in terms of success and failure at the time. Mm-hmm. Because when I think about what I got to do in the 90s now in my music career, and I think about it in those terms, it's amazing. It's amazing what I got to do. It's like I basically got to do everything I set out to do. I toured the world. I made records I'm still proud of. I had an enormous amount of fun. I met and worked with amazing musicians. It was a great experience. But at the time, it felt like a failure. And the reason it felt like a failure was because I'd set such lofty goals for myself that I figured that if I didn't achieve everything I set out to achieve, that I was a failure. Yeah. And I think that that's pretty typical of the way creative people think. Uh-huh. Like success for me was getting to have a career like Tom Waits or something. It's like, what is success? I want to be a living legend or what. I mean, it's like egomaniac stuff. And also looking around me and seeing what was happening for Evan and Juliana and other people that I'd come up with who were enjoying enormous success and thinking like, why can't I have that life? And that's also typical. So thinking in terms of like, okay, it's all or nothing. I'm going to go for the success, and if I don't have it, I'm going to move on. Is kind of the sort of black and white thinking that was very typical for me at the time, which I've thankfully moved on from. I have different contexts. But it was like, okay, I'm gonna figure out a way to make this work. And we weren't married yet, so Heather was like, okay, we got married in 2000. She still married that guy that was acting like such a lunatic, right? Blessings abound, But at the time, I was just like, I'm going to salvage this.
What's the matter with me? I might be crazy, but I sure ain't free. If nothing's better than this, then it's the illusion, baby, I'm gonna miss. Yeah. I feel like a beginner. I might be a loser, 'cause I sure ain't a winner. So shy when I get high, my skin couldn't get any thinner. Put yourself in touch with the ground, ooh, neighborhood town. There's nothing on the other side of suicide, but what's better than nothing?
should backtrack a little bit and talk about Ed, because Ed Ackerson was my best friend at the time. He sadly passed away a few years ago. Ed is an incredibly creative guy, musician, producer. He had a band called 27 Various in Minneapolis, and then a band that I was involved with called Polera, which was signed to Interscope Records. And, they were never quite successful, but they definitely got really close, and he made a lot of great records. And it's become a real priority for me at this stage in life to talk about Ed as much as I can, because, his life was cut short, and, I want people to know about his work. But the person that I called when I wanted to make this record that was the one that was hopefully going to put me on the map was Ed. And I said, here's what I want to do. He said, great. So Ed had a studio. He'd taken all the money he got from his record deal, and he bought a building in Minneapolis and fixed it up, and built a studio. There was an amazing facility called Flowers, which is still there. His widow, Ashley, runs it now. I booked time to go up there for a couple of weeks and record. But before I did that, I took about 2 or 3 months in Birmingham, and I just treated songwriting like a job. And, I was partying less. I was, more disciplined at this point. I was about to turn 30, I think, at that point, or maybe had turned 30.
I was born in Minneapolis, grew up in Ohio, so I'm a Midwesterner as well. One of the things that we talked about with Paul and that I reflect upon myself is there's a specific work ethic. So when you said you were treating songwriting as a job,
yep.
I'm wondering if you feel that there's a work ethic associated with Midwesterners, which is not to say other parts of the countries don't have a work ethic. Of course they do. To me, as an observation, I feel like maybe it's related to the creative people that I like. Dave Pirner, always writing songs. Mellencamp, always writing songs. These guys are just working, and they're not always scoring hits, but they're working. And I've always admired that. And I'm just curious if you sort of felt that as well.
Yeah, this is interesting because I don't think I had a whole lot of this discipline much at all before this period. It was very easy for me to write the songs for Blake Baby, so it just kind of came naturally to me. And then it was more frustrating to try to write when I was doing those Antenna records. And I don't want to trash them too much because there's some good stuff in there. Certainly, and Paul Mahern loves those records, but I was not particularly disciplined. I wasn't thinking in terms of I've got to roll my sleeves up and get to work. I was sort of working when I felt like it, and I was hanging out when I felt like it. I think the thing that changed me and got me thinking was, so one of my friends back in the early 90s was Sue Miller. She's married to Geoff Tweedy. She was the talent buyer I think the owner of the club Lounge Acts, famous club in Chicago. And I used to stay at her place when we go up there and play shows and hang out with her a fair amount. This is before she and Geoff were married, but they were, I think, dating and living together. And she was telling me how frustrating it was to be in a relationship with Geoff because he would just, for long days would just like shut the door and just work the whole time. Like he was probably working on being there at that point, or maybe Yankee Hotel Foxtrot, but it was early in the Wilco thing. And I was a huge fan of his and, friendly with him, but, not a close friend. But I was kind of in awe of his talent. And Sue was just like, yeah, he never stops working. He'll work 12 hours at a time. And I was like, oh, that's what I'm doing wrong, because how do I get to that level? How do I get that good? Obviously I have some ability and some talent that's driving me at this point, but what's missing? And I sort of decided, that really made a big impression on me. And I decided that what I needed was to find that work ethic. Now that served me well subsequently because now I have to work all the time. And I feel like every day has been, a lot of work since I decided to become a lawyer and have children, At the time it was digging deep. Heather would go to work in the morning. I would get up and, set up on the couch and work on my songs until she got home. So by the time I went to Minneapolis to make the record, I felt that I had the best set of songs that I've ever written, and wrote them all on my own, and felt that and I think at that time the rock music was changing in a way that was disorienting too. In '98, we had a big rock station in Birmingham called the X. They're all called something like that, the X. and 107.7 The X. And, everybody listened to it, and rock was huge business. Lemonheads had been out in 97 touring with Matchbox 20. We're really cool guys, but it's kind of like, that's not really what we do. That's a different thing. And I sort of felt alienated from rock then because I didn't like most of the stuff they played on the X. I thought most of it was garbage. Not garbage, the band, they were fine.
Right. I got you, yeah.
Z105.
And we're back!
Folks, real special guest here this morning. Dirty Dad, the garbage man, Z105's newest DJ is here.
Hey, Socrates, what's up?
Yeah, nice. Classic. Now, Dirty Z, I understand the FCC kicked you off the air for something you said down there?
That's right. I had this character, the notorious HIV.
Yeah.
They didn't dig on it. I'm not really allowed to talk about it till the lawsuit's over. But,
I was living in Birmingham around this time. I know the station and went from college radio where... And that was your comfort zone. Blake Babies and Lemonheads were widely celebrated in college radio. But all of a sudden, you cross that boundary and start talking to commercial radio, and it's a vastly different story. Vestavia came into my life as a radio person at that time. And I want to talk about songs because, man... I think I mentioned to you, John, when I got the record, I thought, what are we going to spin? Because I hear 5 singles. I hear 5 songs off of this full length that are all, in my estimation, worthy of being the front runner. So we were confused, but confused because the overall quality of the record was so strong.
Thank you. That's great to hear. Well, I was trying to the formula that I was pursuing in the way that I was writing it was very deliberate, and because I was disoriented with where things were going, because I felt like the early 90s was a really exciting time for rock. It seemed like anything was possible, and then it seemed like everything was kind of metastasizing into this formula around this radio format. And most of that I really didn't like. I mean, it's as bad as music can possibly be, in my view. It's like that commercial alternative stuff.
Don't hold back, John. Don't hold back.
No, I'm serious. I mean, it's like you take something great like Pavement, and then you give it to some knuckleheads who, make a frat boy hit out of it. It's like, or you take all this sort of superficial elements and, make it sort of suitable for the masses. It was cynical and it was gross. I did not like what you're doing. It made me angry. It was offensive.
Wow.
No, it really was. I was angry about alternative radio at the time because I felt like it was the death of a dream. Like everything from hardcore through, Nirvana breaking to a couple of years after, it's like, oh, this is the world I want to live in. And then all of a sudden it's like, this sort of cynical kind of turn into what we call content now, the sort of commerce, it's like, no, this is not good. But I also was a pragmatist, and I was like, I need to make something that feels authentic to me, that's real creative expression, from my soul, that could possibly find a home in that world. And so that was kind of the challenge that Ed and I took on, because Ed is a producer, and he's a really good producer, and he understood this. So, he shared my cynicism at the time. I mean, all of us coming out of that were equally angry about, alternative rock, the format, I mean, it was disappointing, right? Like the stuff that, it was boardroom stuff, And so if you were, the reason why it was offensive, let me back up for a second, because I don't want anyone to take this personally. The reason why it was offensive is because it was taking something that was like purely the product of creative music scenes, with people making something, on their own without the influence of the industry, in the underground, and sort of taking the raw materials of that and turning it into commerce.
Because I love Vestavia so well, and Wouldn't Want to Be Me is the opening track. That's a song that should have been played on every alternative radio station in America.
Well, thanks. I mean, I thought it had a shot. This is, I'll tell you first a little bit about making it. And And then I'll tell you the sort of moment that I kind of saw that I was at that fork in the road that was, not going to be me having a career in music, But I think when Ed and I were making it, we were excited because we thought we were kind of getting it. It's like these songs is the best material I can write, and we're approaching and arranging and producing them in a way that's, that's going to be familiar. I don't think it was completely cynical. It wasn't like A-Bing it against Everclear records or whatever, but we're like, okay, this could make sense in that context, right? And, I set out to make the record, like my original idea, and this is another egomaniac thing on my part, but I set out to make the record where I was going to record every note on it myself. And I did a couple songs like that. I think Ava Braun is all me. I think there's a couple of them. I can't remember which, but it was so exhausting that eventually I just had to say uncle. And we brought in Polara's drummer, Peter Anderson, who's great. And Ed played bass. It's like they kind of picked up the parts. I was like, okay, there's no point in doing that. But, that was the original concept. It was a true solo record, like Stevie Wonder style. But I'm no Stevie Wonder, Not on drums, not on vocals, not on keyboards, not on nothing, but I bring to it what I bring to it, so I was trying to kind of get whatever I had to offer into the record. And, we had a great time making it and we felt really good about it. And I remember, I'm not going to name names here, but I was working with a lawyer at the time. This is very consequential because I sent it to my lawyer. It's kind of a music biz lawyer. And he was one of the first people that I sent the record to because, I wanted him to help me get a record deal or whatever. And he got it and he was just like, this is fantastic. He's like, I didn't know what to expect, but this is so far beyond my expectations. He's like, this is going to, I can't wait to send this to people, And that was the first reaction I got. So I was just like, oh, I nailed it, great. This is something that's not going to pull my leg. It's like it's in his hands now. And I told Heather about that. She was a little skeptical. I was like, wow, lawyer dude loves it. And she's like, okay, well, we'll see where it goes. And then he did nothing. Just like several months went by and he barely sent any out to anybody. And it was stagnant, So I wasn't going to get a record deal. It wasn't going to get on the radio. He kind of put it out on a little independent label and did a few dates behind it. And that was it.
Yeah.
It didn't really have a run at all. It was not really, it was nationally distributed and sold a couple thousand copies, but it was not something that was going to establish a career. And that was kind of the point was, this is either going to open doors or it's not, Yeah. And I see now that the record that we made really isn't something that could in any universe have been a hit on alternative radio. And I'm fine with that,
You don't think?
Well,
I disagree.
Well, I didn't hear it until recently, and I sent Geoff a text. I was making dinner, and I listened to it. I'm like, this is right in my fucking sweet spot. That's exactly the type of rock and roll that I like. So I suppose we could probably argue, the three of us could probably argue whether or not it had a home on AOR radio or AAA at the time. Alternative radio, I might agree with you. But I think AOR or AAA, sure, at the time.
Wouldn't Want to Be Me was the opener, but honestly, what I think my radio station ended up playing more than any other track was Edison Medicine.
Oh, wow.
It's got all the heft and dirt in the guitars and that alternative radio sound of the time. I thought it fit right in, man.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it didn't get a shot, obviously. I mean, they played it on the X. Well, I had a dear friend there who's still one of my best friends to this day, Scott Register, if you remember Reg's Coffee House.
Reg, yeah.
Reg is one of the greatest dudes in the world. And he had a similar cynicism about the whole thing, but, you know, he was also responsible for bringing, you know, music to that station that actually literally broke in Birmingham, including Train and John Mayer. You know, that would have been the less offensive side of alternative rock to me, those kinds of artists, because they weren't sort of mining the rotting corpse of college rock, you know.
Yeah.
It was more like mainstream rock and roll music. You know, Ed and I are coming from a place where we love the Byrds and we love British Invasion stuff, you know, we love, you know, the band and country rock and stuff like that. And that's really the source. And when people started hearing that record, again and again, they were saying this sounds like Tom Petty, which at the time it was interesting because since then I've become a huge fan of Tom Petty. But at the time, I didn't really think about Tom Petty much, you know.
Really?
Yeah. I knew the hits, but I didn't own any Tom Petty records. But, you know, I think that it's kind of like mining the same sources, like being obsessed with those late 60s Byrds records and stuff. Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers are just, you know, they're revivalists in a sense. You know, it's kind of what we were doing. And by the way, and I want to say this, and this is super important, because obviously I was kind of full of a lot of angst around music at that point. I was, you know, feeling like a failure, feeling disappointed, feeling like, you know, the entire music thing had taken a right turn and sort of left a lot of us behind. But if I had success with Vestavia, let's say that it was, 10 times more successful than it was, you know, which would mean it sold 20 or 30,000 copies, you know, put me in a deal where I could make another couple records. I still, you know, think it would have just delayed the life that I was meant to have, you know, because once I sort of actually moved on from it and went back to school and got married and had children and found my way back into the music business as an advocate, that's been a really rich and satisfying life for me. Like, I cannot imagine my life without my family, and I can't imagine my life without my career. And I could have wasted a lot of time, you know, sort of chasing that elusive dream, you know, like people I know did, and, you know, sort of gotten into my 40s and still, you know, be like a college dropout without much to show for it, you know, and I'd still be known as the guy in the Blake Babies, right? And I'm really grateful to Heather for, you know, kind of forcing me to that crossroads, because it wasn't like she was saying you have to give up music or anything like that. She was saying something very reasonable, which is, you know, I'm in love with you. I want to have a life with you. I want to have children. You know, I want to live a life and have a nice home and not worry about money all the time. How are we going to do that? You know, and I could possibly have done it as a musician, but I would have had to be a wildly successful musician, I see. And that would have meant that I wouldn't have been home every day to see my kids, you know, and that's been the most important thing of all, is to actually raise my children, you know. Now that I'm back playing music, and now that I'm looking at the next 20 years of my life and looking forward to being a guy that makes music again, you know, not professionally, but in a serious way, that's fine. I can pick it up. You know, it's like I don't really have anything to prove or you know, any grand design goals around it. I just love making music.
You know, during that era, we did kind of watch what was alternative radio die a awkward death.
Oh, it got so much worse. I mean, it was, you know, the 2000-ish, you know, like the new metal era was just, it was just disgusting. You know, it was awful what it turned into. And you know, it's rock really, I haven't really felt bound to a genre since then, because, you know, I would have, you know, in the early 90s, I would have said, yeah, I'm a rock and roll musician. You know, I play rock, and it's like, you know, but rock turned into something else, and it really sort of ate itself in a way.
Yes.
And, you know, it became kind of misogynist and, you know, sort of macho and, you know, all these things that were not representative of my values at all.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I still love great rock music, but, you know, I've really made my career since then working with singer-songwriters and, you know, roots musicians. some of them successful.
Was the explosion of that nu metal macho bullshit in retaliation for the success of the Lilith movement, the success that women were having through the 90s? And was it constructed as such by the industry? I'm finger quoting for folks. Industry. I'm not quite that cynical, but I think the industry certainly embraced it, and I think there was a backlash against women.
Well, now that I've been inside the music industry for 20 years and have much more insight into how things work inside the music industry. Now, I've never worked at a major label, but I've worked with big acts, and I've worked in marketing, and I think that the sort of conspiracy theories that we traded in, thinking that there was some kind of grand design or conspiracy with the music industry where they were really, making things bad for us on purpose or whatever. I don't think it works that way. I don't think it's that intelligent. I don't think that there are grand designs for patterns. I think that the music industry chases commerce.
Mm-hmm, for sure.
I really like the genre bending and mixing that happens. Like I was a massive hip hop fan in the 80s and 90s, and I mean, still up to a point. I think there's still great hip hop going on, but I think that the rap rock thing is a sort of a inevitable genre blending, right? You're going to take elements of rap and you're going to put it with hard rock, and it was a sort of a reinvention of metal that had elements of other kind of macho, chest thumping music, So I think that all developed pretty organically, and I think the industry just got behind it. I think it was driven in part by misogyny, but I don't think it was a reaction against, women saying, what about us having our moment? Now, I'm really, really grateful that the industry, the media, the culture around music, there's a much more active conversation about, being as inclusive as we possibly can be when it comes to, race or gender or queerness or whatever. I mean, it's like, I think the creative musicians really, really want to be inclusive and sensitive. And I'm not going to say it wasn't present, because it was very present in indie rock. Think about it. It's like the band I was in was me and two women, and they were both strong feminists, and everybody around us shared our values and our politics and stuff. It wasn't like we were outliers. And that's a very, very different culture than the culture of Fred Durst and all that stuff.
Yes.
They don't really have anything in common other than the superficial, we're making music for an audience, It's like we're trying to get a message out, I guess, But it's kind of hard to define what the message that Blake Baby's had was, other than Juliana's neurotic shit,
As well loved as it is. I think that provides us a good segue into some of what you're thinking about and writing about now in this song, This American Lie. I think there's a narrative there, and then right at the end, you kind of pull a sneaky little sucker punch lyrically where it's like, stay the fuck away from me. Like, whoa, okay. Like, I get it.
So I wrote that song, and I'm not going to make any mystery about my politics. I'm on the left. It's like I'm disturbed by, the rise of Christian nationalism. It's scary to me. And I live in a neighborhood where that's very prevalent. And I should say I'm on the left. I'm really, more in the center. I'm bothered by extreme views on any side. But, around the 2016 election, I wrote that song in 2016. It's taken me a while to get it, pull it all together. So I wrote that when I started to see the way people were changing their attitudes about each other during the rise of Trump.
This American lie, through cynical lies and shimmering twilight. This American dream, it's torn at the seam, rejected want you to stay. I want you to stay. Stay the fuck away from
What I like about that song, I think that is one of the best songs I've written ever, is that superficially it's very pretty. It's
Right.
it's like a very tightly coiled anger behind that song, because I was angry when I wrote that. I was mad about it. I didn't like the changes in my community. I didn't like the fact that all of a sudden people were suspicious of each other. I thought that was a really negative thing, and I still do. But I don't want to write political songs like Billy Bragg writes political songs. I don't want to be laying it out there. I want it to be subtle. I want it to be something you'd have to listen to it a few times to understand what I'm even talking about. But once you do, then it should be very clear. Every lyric fits like a puzzle then, so that's the way that I approach songwriting now. So I think that up to now, taking the Blake Babies out of it, up to now, Vestavia has always been my sort of mountaintop for the best I could do. And I'm very proud of that record. I think we really did nail what we set out to do. And I think it is, it holds up well. When I listen to it now, I'm still proud of it. I think we did a good job with that record. And I want people to hear it. I want them to rediscover it. That's one of the reasons I'm grateful you guys want to talk about it. But now it's like, I have no reason to do it at all, right? To make music. I don't need it for my livelihood. I do something else for a living. I'm almost certainly not going to get any traction with it, so I have a handful of fans out there that are excited to hear it, but it really is just a handful. So considering all that, there's absolutely no reason for me to make a note of music that's less than the best I can do. It's like, if I'm going to put music out in the public, it had better be the very best music I'm capable of making, and that means, getting better on my instrument. That means being a better singer. That means, taking the time with the writing and the recording to make sure that it's representative of the best music I can make. And once it's that, then I want everyone to hear it, But it might be another 10 years before I can make another record, because I don't have a lot of time,
I don't know. You're about to be an empty nester, man. You're going to have a lot of time.
Well, I got 3 more years, I got 3 more years with Sophie. So that's great stuff. But no, I mean, everyone in my family is supportive of it. And, my dream as a musician now, like my dream when I was young, when I was, 25, was I wanted to be massive, but did I really want that? No. Would I have been comfortable in my skin if I was somebody on the covers of magazines? Not really. I brushed up against that. I played in the Lemonheads when they're at the peak of their career, and I was never comfortable with that. I don't want to be a big public figure. But what I do want very much, and what I'm willing to work for and pursue, is I want to have an audience, even if it's, 1,000 people around the world or whatever, that, I can have a conversation with through the music I'm making, that actually enjoy it and consume it. And if I can, play a handful of shows every year and have people come out and want to hear the songs, that's just pure delight for me now. It's delightful, because I have nothing else invested in it other than just the joy of doing it. And I love to work hard on it now. I've found that work ethic, now that I've been working hard for 30 years to make a living and raise a family. It's like, I do have work ethic now. I'm writing songs again now for whatever the next thing I do is. And if I have the whole afternoon, I'm going to spend the whole afternoon working on songs, and I love that. It doesn't feel like work. If there's one soapbox that I want to stand on for music making at this stage in life, and I'll be 56 this month, I'm not a kid anymore, and I accept that. But I think that older people need to be creative. But I think creating is such an important dimension for the human experience generally. The fact is, there's a couple 100 million tracks on Spotify or whatever. It's like an ocean of music, If you want to put music out into the market, you can do it. It's easy to do. And there's no downside to it. It's not like the good music doesn't get found because there's so much bad music. I mean, if you have something to say it, because the creative expression and the creative experience is the point. And, if you build an audience and if you get paid for it and if you have fun times doing it, that's the great, but, I'm going to keep doing creative stuff as long as I'm able, and I'm thrilled about it because, I set it aside because I had more important things to do to get to the point where I am now, where I don't have to worry about it as much.
The ABCs, right? Always be creating, and creativity can manifest itself in different ways. It doesn't have to be writing, musician, screenwriting. It doesn't have to be. It can be, I don't know, whatever the fuck you want it to be.
Finger painting.
It can be needlepoint. It really, truly doesn't matter as long as it's something that, you're using your mind and your spirit to make something that wasn't there before.
Yes.
But for me, it's like I'm not going to learn much new stuff now from here on out. It's like I'm not gonna take up golf or whatever. It's like I'm not gonna become an expert in anything else. It's like I kind of have the stuff I do, and I'm gonna drill down on that. But I'm a good guitar player, and there's no reason for me not to be doing that. I think I'm a good songwriter, and and I hope other people agree. It's like I put music out there because I hope people will enjoy it. I hope people will get something out of it. If the music had a life of its own and all of a sudden a lot of people were interested in it, I don't really want that life. If I could switch it on for like 2 weeks a year, that would be fine, but you can't turn it off once you're in public,
Right. And you have ringside seats to some people that can't turn it off. I mean, you work in your current role as an attorney with people that live it every day.
Well, I have had very, very successful clients, and I've been close with them, and I've seen very much what their lives are like day to day. And it's you have to be wired a certain way to be able to hang in there and do that, because it's very challenging. But being a famous person in 2023 is not fun. It's like for me, I'm still, I have a much thicker skin than I used to, but if I open Twitter and somebody's being rude to me, it's like it affects me. It's like, why are they picking on me? I don't understand. So multiply that by 10,000. It's like every day is people shitting on you, and every which way. If you're famous, I mean, it's just we idolize and obsess over famous people, and we hate them. And there's so many people hiding behind anonymous social media persona where their whole deal is just to go out there and make people feel like shit. If you're obscure, you're going to be safe from that. If you make yourself a public figure, you are right on target. And I know that there's never going to be a time in my life when I'm just like, oh, that's cool. There's just 900 people shitting on me on Twitter today.
No. I would not want that.
It's not what I'm signing up for. That's not why I'm putting out music, And by the same token, it's like, it's nice to get to, and it's a great privilege, and it's something I don't take lightly, but it's nice to get to the point where I've been working all this time, and, it's like, if I can break even making music, that's great. If I can bring in enough money to kind of offset the cost, then I consider that to be very, very successful. So that's kind of the definition of success for me now. Making enough to offset my costs, being able to go out and play a handful of shows every year and have people actually show up and enjoy it. That's the pinnacle. But I don't mean to suggest that there's any possibility that I'm going to have to deal with the trappings of fame myself, But I just want to make clear that's not why I'm doing it. But but on the other hand, that doesn't mean that I'm a hobbyist and I can just throw whatever BS out there into the marketplace. It's like I am the kind of craftsman with music where it's like, if I'm going to make it public, it's going to be the best I can do. Just the same as if I were, making somebody a coffee table or whatever. It's like, I'm going to get it right. I have 4 albums that I own and control, and those are something that I worked very hard, that I care very deeply for, and I'm very proud of those records. And I want people to hear them. And if I have people coming out of the woodwork saying like, hey, this album that nobody talks about anymore that you made in 1998, 8 or whatever is something that I'm thinking about. I want to have a conversation about it. I want to share it with people. Well, that's awesome. I mean, that's incredibly gratifying, because, if you called me and wanted to talk about, an album that I'm not that proud of, it would be difficult. I don't know what I was thinking. I was high the whole time, but this one is one where, I don't want to, I'm not trying to be cool about this. When I made Vestavia, when Ed and I, my best friend, who I sadly lost a few years ago and think about every day, when we had the opportunity to make that record, we were very present. We were trying very hard to make something that was going to still resonate, 30 years on.
And here we are.
And it does. And so let's close on this. I have one final question about Vestavia, if I can.
Yeah.
Which is revisiting it now with that context of, what does it mean today? I think when it came out, I perhaps was dismissive of the track Jesus Let Me In for what I hope are obvious reasons. Now, listening back, that may be my favorite tune on the record. Is there anything that has shifted for you from when you made it to now, listening back? Is there anything that grabs you different?
I should probably, have a real revisit with it, because, I don't remember what I was thinking with that song, honestly. It wasn't a religious statement. It's like I was not at all a religious person. Ed is the one person that I've ever collaborated with who was completely straight with me about, would call bullshit on me when I was not giving it my all, especially with lyric writing. And he was kind of critical of that song because he was like, why the religious imagery? Because, my take on it, my faith is different now than it was then. Yeah, I'm trying to think what else. It's like I love the song Drive Through. My wife hates that song.
Really?
I'm not sure why. Yeah, I played it I was in a songwriter round a couple of years ago, just before the pandemic, and I pulled that one out, and she's like, I can't stand that song. And I think she feels like it's jaunty. She thinks she doesn't like the feel of it.
You got a tough audience at home, man.
Oh, it is. No, it's extraordinarily tough, which is good because I sat down with Heather and she has, look, I owe so much to her. She was the only person in my life who really encouraged me to go in the direction I went, because nobody else was telling me I was smart enough to, go out there and be a lawyer, so, she believed in me from the start. But when I finally played her the new album and we listened to it start to finish, she was blown away by it, but she'll call it out when she doesn't like it. She's like, that's not on. But my favorite song on Vestavia is In Your Dreams. I just, that's a song that it's the math and it works perfectly. I can listen to or play that song as many times as I need to. I just find it very, very satisfying. Oh, and the other one that I'm really proud of that I think is kind of like deceptive because it's kind of got a sort of jokey element to it, especially with the title, is Ballad of Lobster Boy. I think that's one that I'm glad I wrote that. I mean, it's ridiculous in a way,
Is that a nod to David Foster Wallace? Didn't he have a book of short stories called something with a lobster?
I'm not familiar with that. I mean, I'm familiar with his work. I read Infinite Jest, but I don't know anything about lobster.
Come on, John. Did you finish Infinite Jest?
I did. Yeah, I did. I'm from the 90s,
I am too, and I couldn't finish that fucking thing.
I read the footnotes. Well, it was you kind of had to in a certain but I loved his work. No, so the Lobster Boy was a famous, kind of a freak show, sideshow act who was sort of famously abusive. Like he was like a terrible person, and he had an act where he would just kind of get up there and, like, when he wanted to get the crowd out, to get a new crowd out, and he'd get his dick out and wave it at them and stuff like that. He was a terrible person. So I was trying to kind of, get into the sort of emotional landscape of the Lobster Boy. Welcome to the 90s. Yeah. But I think it's a beautiful song. I love Ed's string arrangement in there. There's a lot of stuff in there that I'm really, really glad that we were able to pull off. So. Yeah, I mean, look, I hope that record has some kind of life from here.
I said I had one last question on Vestavia, and I lied. I'm sorry. And maybe it's more of a comment. We could probably do an entire episode just on Polera, and your friendship with Ed is obviously really special to you. I don't know if this was intentional and something that you did after the fact, but if anybody listening to this episode wants to go out and pursue listening to Vestavia, if you pull it up on Spotify, the artist is not listed as John P. Strohm. The artist listed on Spotify is John P. Strohm, Ed Ackerman, Pete Anderson. So, you put Ed's name right there in the band name here. What a lovely way to honor your friend, and I don't know if it's always been that way or if you made that edit after he passed, but it's a lovely acknowledgement.
Yeah, well, thank you. And I can't even remember our thinking, but I do consider that album to be a collaboration between Ed and me. I consider it like it wouldn't have happened without him. It wouldn't be the same record without him at all. And in fact, when we made the new one, the intention was always to end up in Minneapolis and mix with Ed, It was all going that way. And, we ended up finishing up with Mayhern, with Paul, which is fine, which is great. I mean, Paul did an incredible job, but, Paul's one of my best friends. He understands my relationship with that. Those are the two people that I've worked with the most in the studio by far. And, it's not like, oh, we can't have Ed, we'll have Paul instead. It's like, I needed to have Ed on that record, and I'm so grateful that he contributed to it meaningfully. There's a song I was able to write it's called Something to Look Forward To, that I was able to write lyrics to after he passed as kind of a tribute, because we made that song together in his studio, in the same room where we did Vestavia. And that was just in 2019. That was like 6 weeks before he passed away, when he was already very sick. And I'm so grateful to have had that kind of full circle experience, and been able to, knowing that I was saying goodbye to my friend. I knew that was the last time we'd be in the same space together. And, the weight of that was not lost on me then, and it isn't now. And, sometime in the next month, I'm going to publish a piece where I'm going to tell that story. And, it's a mission for me. Like I did the work to get all of his back catalog up on platforms recently, because it was such an injustice that it wasn't up there. It's like I was going to call whoever I needed to call to get those records released, because his music's great and left such an impression on me. And I feel duty bound to carry his work forward, because if he lived to be 100, he'd be making records till he's 100, no question. And I'm going to keep talking about it as long as I can, because one of my goals. My goal for Ed's music is much loftier than my goal for my music. It's like I want him to be remembered like Nick Drake's remembered. I want him to be somebody whose influence is acknowledged. And that's an important soapbox for me. Well, this has been fun, you guys. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, man. I want to thank you. This is great.
Thank you so much.
Many thanks to John for his time and sharing his story with us.
Our theme song is Rocket Sled by Blip. Abandoned Albums was recorded at Thunder Love Studios.
Produced and written by Keith R. Higgins and Geoff Calhoun.
Engineered and mixed by Steve Beasley with the help of Mike Hunt. Edited by AJ Royce.
The songs you heard during this podcast were Wouldn't Want to Be Me, Better Than Nothing, Edison Medicine, This American Lie, and Jesus Let Me In. This American Lie is a sneak peek from John's forthcoming album. You can stream Vestavia and all of John's work wherever you stream your favorite music.
Original music by Mike Pellegrino.
If you like what you've heard, please be sure to subscribe and leave us a rating. It really does help. Thanks for listening.
At Twitter, we are at Abandoned Albums, and on Instagram, we are at Abandoned_albums.
Grazie. Bailey Leaf. Rob Janicki. Mike Pellegrino. Therina Vella. Ronnie Barnett. S.W. Loudon. Michael Janicki. Peyton Janicki. And our executive producer,
Rufus Thunderlove.
And now, until we meet again next time, I remain as always obediently yours.
Abandoned Albums is a production of Paw Print Media.